How to Stay Invisible, Chapter 7. Even with the fresh stock of gum wrappers, Raymond nearly froze. He dug a small pit in the ground for his fire and circled it with larger rocks that he'd gathered from the woods. Though it lowered the visibility of the flames, he still didn't keep a fire going into the night. He was worried that somebody would see it through trees, or worse, that he might set the woods on fire. There weren't any houses for at least a mile around the school. Raymond had checked. But cars still occasionally drove on the country roads at night. In that part of the county, it wasn't unusual for leftover brush fires or chimneys to burn into the night. But Raymond was careful. The last thing he wanted was to send up a smoke signal for someone to find him and drag him back to the children's home. At breakfast on Friday, Harlan walked cheerfully up to Raymond, but was shoved into the table by an unknown assailant. The table jerked, spilling Raymond's milk and knocking over his neighbor's bottle of water. "Oof," Harlan said. "Sorry about that. Must tripped." Harlan brushed himself off and looked around. The boy who knocked into him was laughing with a friend as they left the cafeteria. Raymond hurried to clean up the spilled milk, but Harlan didn't seem to notice. He sat down and stuffed his muffin into his mouth. "You seen the jamboree posters around?" Harlan asked, muffin falling from his mouth. "Can't miss them," Raymond responded. The posters were everywhere. Raymond finished cleaning up the milk and helped clean the water across the table. Harlan picked the water bottle up from the floor, but it was misshapen now that he stuck a finger through the mouth of the bottle, popping it back to its original form. Then he held it out to the kid sitting next to them. The kid looked incredulously at Harlan, rolled his eyes, and got up muttering something that didn't even sound much like "thank you." Harlan shrugged and set the bottle down. All of a sudden, Raymond remembered the minnows, and it hit him. The bottle! He could use the empty bottles that he'd found to make traps for catching minnows. After school, Raymond could hardly wait to get back to the hollow. He had 3 empty water bottles. He took out his fishing knife and cut off the top of one bottle. Then he flipped the top around so that it looked like a funnel. He wedged the funnel into the bottom half of the bottle. It was so simple. He didn't need a net. He had everything he needed to make traps. He repeated the procedure on the other 2 bottles and then jogged to the river, traps in tow. He found a few large rocks and used them to sink the traps and hold them in place under the water. He placed the traps along the bank where he had tried to catch minnows before. Now, there wasn't anything to do but wait. Rosie nudged his leg. "Hungry?" he asked her. He'd been so excited about the traps that he hadn't even thought about saving food from breakfast or lunch. But now his stomach groaned. He wondered how long it would take to catch minnows. He checked the traps. They were empty. His stomach growled again, and he decided to check the dumpsters. The sun was setting, but it was still light out when he reached the school. He checked the parking lots, and they were empty of buses and cars. It was a Friday night, and everyone had cleared out early, no doubt. Still, Raymond didn't want to risk being seen, so he pulled himself up and into the dumpsters. It had been a sunny day, and the contents were smelly. He dumped out a bag and tried not to breathe through his nose. There was definitely nothing edible in there. He opened bag after bag and found more of the same. He made up his mind that he would just go back to the river and try his luck when he spotted a large silver can. He grabbed it, gagging at the trash that clung to it, and jumped from the dumpster. He sucked in fresh air and wiped the can clean with his hand. It didn't have a label, but it was free of rust and dents, so Raymond knew whatever was inside would probably be safe to eat. He walked back to camp and popped the top. Raymond had never been so excited to see Chef Boyardee in his life. family size and everything. He thought about making a fire to warm it up, but he was too hungry. He ate sloppily, pouring the contents into his mouth. It wasn't spaghetti, but it was just as satisfying. Rosie waited patiently for her portion, only whimpering the slightest bit. Raymond nodded through mouthfuls and dutifully shared half of the ravioli with her. "Next time, we'll warm it up first," he told Rosie. When they finished their dinner, Raymond washed up in the creek. His stomach wasn't quite as empty as before, but it definitely wasn't full either. This seemed to be Raymond's new normal. Not quite starving, but not exactly full. It was too dark to check the traps again tonight, so Raymond built a fire and tried not to think about roasted fish. He woke up early the next morning and immediately thought of the traps. He grabbed his fishing gear and walked to the river just as the sun was starting to rise. Rosie trotted along beside him. At the river, one of the traps had come loose, and he found it floating near the bank. He bent to pick it up. It was empty. The second trap was half filled with sand, but no minnows. Raymond's good mood vanished. It was soon lifted, though, by the contents of the third trap. 2 minnows skirted the bottom of the bottle as Raymond lifted it from the river. He let out a yelp and punched the air. The sun was up now. He put the empty traps back into the water, closer together this time where the third trap had been. Then he set his 2 minnows down carefully and baited his hook. Raymond took a deep breath as he cast his line. This was good. He would be able to catch more fish now, and Rosie would have more to eat. Now that he had a better chance of feeding her, he realized how worried he had been about it. He caught 2 fish in the first hour. He cooked them, building a fire right there on the bank of the river. He checked his traps and found 2 more minnows. He baited his hooks and began roasting fish as he caught them. For the rest of the day, he repeated this process. He fished, cooked, and ate. He shared his catch with Rosie, who graciously accepted. Then at the close of the day, he stamped out the fire and walked back to camp with his first full belly in weeks. I can do this, he repeated to himself, and he was starting to really believe it. On Sunday, Raymond walked through the woods with Rosie at his heels, gathering fallen limbs and dragging them back to camp. The trees were dense in this area, and while it provided cover for Raymond, it also tended to keep things pretty wet if it rained. Raymond had learned that he could lay his kindling and firewood in a sunny spot to dry during the school day and then use the dried sticks to build a fire in the evening. He decided to build a lean-to against the sunny side of the hollow to keep the moisture off his firewood. He vaguely remembered the field trip lesson on building shelters and thought he would at least give it a try. When he had a pile of tree limbs, he set to work. He broke off any branches that stuck out from the larger limbs and tossed them in a pile until he had a small mountain of branches, each roughly an inch in diameter. He broke the ends from the branches to make them the same length, and he did the same to the larger limbs by propping them against the tree and using the weight of his foot to break them in half. When he was satisfied, he began to weave the branches together, making a lattice pattern on the ground. Eventually, he had a wall of branches that he had lifted up and propped against the side of the hollow. Some of them fell, and he adjusted the weave or just replaced them with another. It took him a few tries, and he thought it could have looked a little neater, but that didn't really matter. Once the frame of the lean-to was against the tree, Raymond gathered smaller sticks and vines to weave in between the larger branches. It was time-consuming, tedious work, and the sun was behind him before he knew it. He sat against the hollow, exhausted but feeling good. Rosie groaned, and Raymond decided to give it a rest for the day. "Let's get dinner, Rosie," he told her, and they headed to the river. Just want to give a shout out to Lucy. Hey Lucy, I hope your summer's going great. As you can tell, if you see my pictures on Facebook, mine's going wonderful.